My name's Ted Farmer, and I teach history at New River Community College. And I have been a baseball fan since October 9th, 1973. I became a baseball historian by default through memorizing the backs of my baseball card collection, particularly the statistics. But I think it was the sportscaster Bryant Gumbel that said, all other sports are just sports. Baseball is a love. And to a lot of people that might seem like overblown hyperbole, but for me it's definitely true. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Baseball is enjoyable to play physically, it's aesthetically beautiful to watch, and it is multifaceted in terms of its uniqueness. And I can give a lot of examples of that, but several that just come to mind right off. The playing field. Most playing fields in terms of sports are rectangular. The baseball field is a diamond. Most action takes place on a diamond. The defense has the ball. That's unique to baseball. There's no clock, and there's really no uniformity in terms of the field itself. All parks are different in terms of the length between the home plate and the fences and things such as that. So it's a very unique sport, and as a historian, it is a gold mine, and that's my primary interest in baseball. Has been for a long time, particularly the statistical aspect of it. But the history of the game goes back really for the better part of 175 years in this country. It's been a major part of baseball culture for almost 200 years now. The transformation from a child's game to an adult's game, a major business, began really in the 1840s. And not coincidentally, it started about the time period where the Industrial Revolution in the United States was really taking full effect. And right after the Industrial Revolution took full effect, you had something known as the Leisure Revolution in this country. And the Leisure Revolution is an aspect of American history that isn't nearly as well studied as it should be in most history classes, but baseball fits right into there. And it's not, as I said, it's not a coincidence, because urban people needed an outlet, primarily for exercise purposes, for competitive purposes. And the poet Walt Whitman said, it will get our people outdoors, it will fill them with oxygen, and it will give them a larger physical stoicism. One of the great quotes about baseball in the mid-19th century. And so from a historical perspective, it really begins to be an important part of the history of this country around the 1860 to 1869 period, where you have the first professional players emerging. It's really unfortunate that a lot of people, particularly young people, feel that baseball is somehow outdated or old-timey, as some people like to say, and has lost a lot of its relevance. And unfortunately and ironically, I think one of the reasons for that is the fact that in terms of historical documentation, no sport has done a better job of documenting its history than American baseball. I would estimate that more books and articles have been written about baseball than all other sports played in America combined. Every pitch since 1876, with the birth of what we know as Major League Baseball, has been recorded. And so there's just such a wealth of information there. And people that really love the sport have a tendency to look back in any situation that they find themselves in, look back and do comparisons and talk about some sort of historical aspect. It happened to me just yesterday. I was at one of my son's high school games. His teammate was a left-handed pitcher warming up. A gentleman sitting to my right immediately said, well, he looks pretty good, but he's no Warren Spahn. Warren Spahn was a pitcher that pitched in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Before long, the discussion in the area started reverting back even further to people like Walter Johnson, who made his debut in 1908. And you could see that the young people in the crowd were completely lost. And I really think that that's one thing that unfortunately turns young people against baseball. And they think it's something that happened, 300, 400 years ago, when they hear a lot of older people talking about things that they've never heard of, they've never encountered individuals that they have no knowledge of. And that's too bad. It really is, because the history of the game is so rich. And like I say, as a historian, it just makes my life so much better if I can talk baseball history on a daily basis with anybody. And young people these days, I would say by a ratio of 3 or 4 or even 5 to 1, prefer football. And there are a lot of reasons for that as well. Baseball has been known as the national pastime since the emergence of the first professional teams in 1869. However, we live in a society that is unfortunately fast-paced, it's violent, and football, as we all know, is a little more fast-paced in the action. It's much more violent, and I'm still amazed and shocked when I asked young people, or people of any age, why do you prefer football over baseball? And one of the primary reasons that they inevitably offer is they like to see people getting bashed on the field, getting laid out, that kind of thing. They prefer two people colliding rather than a ball and a bat, which I think is unfortunate, but there's no question in my mind that baseball is a dying sport in America, and it really pains me to say that. But there was an article in Sports Illustrated a few years ago, and some of the more pessimistic commentators in that article had an expiration date of 2050. There will be no more Major League Baseball, there will be no more minor league baseball, any baseball of any kind, in their estimation, if it keeps dying at this rate by 2050. Just the opposite is true with football. It gets a little bit more popular in terms of viewership every year. I think this past Super Bowl was the most watched Super Bowl in history. And I don't see how that's going to turn around, certainly not in my lifetime. But football is the new American pastime or national pastime, without a doubt. One of the great myths about baseball is that it hasn't changed much since the beginning of the game, which in certain ways goes back to about 1845, when the New York Knickerbockers sat down with the first 20 rules. But baseball has been changing and modifying itself almost from day one. A lot of people think that if you had people that played the game or watched the game from the 1880s or 1890s, that they could attend a Major League game today and recognize the game immediately. Well, sure, they would know that it's baseball, but with almost no exceptions, everything has changed about the game. The only two things that I can think of right off the top of my head that haven't changed would be the distance between the bases at 90 feet and the width of the plate at 17 inches. All the equipment, the uniforms, the size of the players, the size of the parks, so many of the rules, just about everything about baseball has changed. So it's one of the great myths that the game has this continuity. One of my favorite aspects of baseball are the differences in the parks, and going to each park that I possibly can attend a game at. It has been really a great joy in my life for about the last 30 years. One of my bucket list items is going to Fenway Park in Boston, Massachusetts, which is the oldest park still in use. It goes back to April 1912. I'll be there about a month from now, ironically, and I can't wait to get there. Another one of the parks I really want to visit is Wrigley Field in Chicago, which goes back to 1914. As we speak today, there are only 3 parks that are in existence from before I was born, and I was born in 1966, and Dodger Stadium emerged in 1962, I believe. So there are only 3 that I would consider old, being defined as before I was born. And so The most unique park by most accounts is Fenway Park. The configuration of the park with the left field wall known as the Green Monster, 38 feet high, and all sorts of quirky little things that go back, for the most part, to the very beginning when the park opened in April of 1912. But Wrigley Field is another great park that I would encourage anybody to visit. I have not, unfortunately, but that's another one on my bucket list. There's ivy covering the outfield fences, and the park is really unique in a lot of ways as well. I think of the modern parks, in other words, the parks that have been built since the 1970s, the most noteworthy I can think of would be Oriole Park at Camden Yards in Baltimore. It's personally, at this point, my favorite park and the very first park that I ever visited myself back in the 1990s when it first opened. When you walk into the grounds, you literally have a feeling, or at least I have, and I've talked to others that have expressed the same sentiment, that you've gone back in time, because beyond the right field fence, there's this huge B&O railroad warehouse that dates back to the early part of the 20th century. And that sort of dominates the ambiance of the entire park. So that's one that's really unique that I would encourage people to visit. There are others, of course, but many of them I don't have any firsthand experience with, but certainly Fenway and Wrigley would be near the top of that list as well. Since the amateur era began in baseball in the 1840s, it has provided a vehicle for literally millions of people to improve their personal socioeconomic lot in this life. I think it was Joe DiMaggio that said, no rich kid will ever make it to the major leagues. And until the emergence of a guy named Mike Piazza, whose father owned a series of car dealerships in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Joe DiMaggio was right in that prediction. It has been a not so quick and very difficult route to fame and fortune in this country. The best example of that is also the best player of all time, a man named George Herman Babe Ruth, who grew up in an orphanage. He had been dropped off by his parents at the age of 7 in 1902 in Baltimore, Maryland, and came out of the orphanage at 18 years old, and within about 3 or 4 years became one of the most famous people in the United States, and to this day is one of the most famous and impactful people in the entire 20th century of American history. Ruth served as sort of a good example of how, from the worst circumstances possible, you could make it in this country and achieve all sorts of success by anybody's measure. Unfortunately, before the emergence of Jackie Robinson on the major league level in 1947, the game at the major league level was restricted to white or Latino players only. I would say that the most important person in terms of civil rights in the history of the country is a baseball player, Jackie Robinson. Ruth and Robinson are by far the most important players in the history of the game, and Robinson is bigger than the game because he really did do more than anybody in this country to desegregate the country. Baseball is not unique in terms of being a vehicle for poor, disadvantaged kids to make it in this country. It might actually be the most frustrating because it's the hardest sport to play by most people's estimation. I really can't overestimate, despite all of its past infamies in terms of scandals and injustice, the color barrier that kept Black Americans out of the game for the better part of a century. I can't overemphasize the greatness of the sport and the importance of the sport. And I refer back to this great book titled What Baseball Means to Me. I really encourage everybody that's interested, not just in baseball, but in American life in general, to read that book and a man named George Herbert Walker Bush has one of the entries in that book. And he talks about how his family actually marks milestones in their lives by baseball memories that they have encountered over generations and over the years. You're talking about a man here who became President of the United States, met all sorts of impactful, significant, and great people from around the world, and yet to his dying day, he claimed that his all-time hero was Lou Gehrig, a baseball player, first baseman for the Yankees. This sport's powerful stuff.